Hey guys, I'm Caleb Giddings from Taurus USA, and today we're going to learn how to mount a set of traditional scope rings on your Taurus Expedition Rifle. Now, we have a lot of different options for mounting optics to the Expedition. Because it uses a Remington 700 short action, you can do anything from using a pick rail, or in this case, mounting traditional scope rings directly to the rifle's receiver. To do this, we're going to need a couple of tools. I like to have an Allen wrench to get the screws started in the receiver, and when I'm going through to finally tighten them down, I like to have a torque wrench. This allows me to get them to the proper tightness, which on this gun is in between 30 and 40 inch-pounds, which I have already set my torque wrench to. So the first thing that we're gonna do is I'm gonna pull off the ring that I'm not working with, and then I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that my first ring is aligned with the holes in the receiver. I'm gonna drop that screw in, and I'm gonna go ahead and just get it started in the receiver. Once that's started, I'll go ahead and start the second screw. And now that both of those are started, I can go ahead and just screw them down to finger tightness with my Allen key. Then I will move on to the back ring. There's no right order to do this. You don't have to go front to back or back to front. But there is a right order to tighten your screws once we actually get into mounting the optic, and we'll discuss that when we get to it. Once that's started, I can go ahead and put in my last screw. Now that the screws are largely hand tight into the receiver, I can go ahead and start using my torque wrench to actually torque them down. I'm always going to start with the front screw in anything that I'm doing. Whether it's a pick rail or two individual scope rings like this, I want to start in the front and work my way back. So we're going to go ahead and tighten that down. And the torque wrench breaks over at 40 inch-pounds. Now that the rings are mounted and I've torqued them down, the last thing I want to do is I want to check to make sure that they're not protruding too far through the receiver and interfering with the throw of the bolt. That's accomplished very easily simply by manipulating the bolt. All you do is open it up, run it to the extent of its travel to the rear, and run it forward. No issues here, so these rings are fully mounted and ready to go. The next thing that we'll do is put the optic in. Now that we have the bases of the rings mounted, it's time to actually put the optic in. We have a Leupold VX5 HD scope. This is a 3x15 with a 44mm eyepiece, and it has a 30mm tube. One thing that's important is you need to make sure that your rings match the size of your tube. If you try to mount a 30mm scope in 1-inch rings, it's not gonna go well for you, and vice versa. Don't ask me how I know that. It's a mistake I've made many times. That's how I know that. You end up going to the store and you're all excited with your new optic, and then you realize you've got the wrong size rings for it. And that can be pretty frustrating when all you want to do is go out and shoot. Once we place the scope in the rings, we're gonna go ahead and put the top of the rings on, but we're not gonna fully tighten anything down yet because we need to do two things before we fully tighten. We need to set our eye relief, and we need to make sure that the scope is actually level. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna put the screws in, and I'm gonna get them started enough that they hold the scope a little bit in place, but they don't fully lock it down. You'll notice that I'm placing the screws in the rings in a very specific pattern. This also reflects the pattern that I'm going to go about tightening them when we go to fully tighten this mount down. All right, we can add a couple more screws, and then we can start tightening it, and then we'll set our eye relief. Slightly too tight because I still need to be able to move the scope to set eye relief and to make sure it's level. So we can just back that out. Fun note, I'm not using my torque wrench to loosen anything because that will destroy a torque wrench. So if you are doing anything with a torque wrench, you need to have a manual tool of some sort that you can actually loosen with as well. You don't want to ever use a torque to loosen a screw. So now that this is pretty stable in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set my eye relief. And to do that, I actually need to break it out of the mount. And I'm just going to pick the rifle up and shoulder it in what would be a fairly natural fashion for me. And I'm going to be able to get my eye comfortably behind the reticle without getting too close or without being too far back. And where I have this set right now is just about perfect for me. I don't have any black boxes or shadows in the eye box, and I'm able to see clearly through the reticle. That's lovely. Now that my eye relief is set, I need to make sure it's level before I start tightening it. Fun fact, I actually used to think that leveling a scope meant leveling it in the front to back plane, which I was always confused by because that didn't make any sense since the rings were sort of at a fixed height. I learned that it was actually leveling it that way, not front to back. So I have an actual honest to God level that I'm just going to place on top of here. And then I'm going to turn to make sure that the bubble is in the middle and it's nice and level. Now that that's in place, I can actually go ahead and start tightening my screws down in the order that I originally placed them in, not tightening everything to its exact torque spec first. I want to get everything tight enough that I start feeling the wrench bind, and then I'll go ahead and get everything tight, and then eventually I'll move on to actually torquing them down. All the while making sure to not break the level of the scope. It's important to have your scope level in the windage or the left-right plane, whatever you want to call it, because when you're adjusting this and you're zeroing it, if it's not level and you dial 4 clicks up, those won't actually be truly straight up clicks. They may be a little bit off to the left or a little bit off to the right, depending on whether your scope is leveled. And then as your distance to target gets magnified and increases, that's going to throw those hits off more and more. Now on this, I'm using 25 inch-pounds of torque to make sure that this is an appropriate amount of tightness for what I'm doing. Now that every screw is hand tight and my scope is still level, I can apply the appropriate amount of torque to them. And again, I'm going to start with what would be the top left screw if I was looking down over the rifle. Then I'm going to move over to the bottom right screw on the top mount and tighten that one. I'll go straight back here. And then I'll come across the rifle. So I've kind of made an X pattern across the rifle. Then I'll go up top to the top right screw, the left side, and then the opposite side screws. By tightening everything in an X pattern, at no point do I overstress or overpressure any of the screws. And now my optic is fixed nice and tight in the mounts. I can go ahead and check to make sure it's level one more time. The scope is still nice and level. And that is how you mount a scope in traditional scope bases on the Taurus Expedition.